Well, three major investor groups representing firms like AMP Capital and Australian Super are calling for Australia's largest companies to be forced to disclose how they plan to address financial risks from climate change. In a new report, they're calling for financial regulators to introduce new standards, mandatory standards for climate reporting, saying voluntary disclosure of climate-related risks has failed to provide investors with confidence. They warn a lack of adequate information on climate risk will erode financial stability and will end up moving capital away from industries who fail to be transparent. Erwin Jackson is the Director of Policy at the Investor Group on Climate Change. That's one of the groups behind this report. Erwin Jackson, welcome back to Breakfast.
Good morning, Fred.
Could you explain this for us, Erwin, when it comes to climate modelling, exactly what type of information it is that investors want big corporations to disclose?
Well, if you go back to first principles and to a sort of an analogous example, is when you buy a house, you want to make sure it's a good long-term investment. And in the context of climate change, you'd also want to make sure that that house will be insurable in the future from more extreme weather events. And you'd also want to make sure that that house, if what sort of fuel it's dependent on, if it's dependent on gas, it's going to be really expensive in the future to run. So essentially what investors are asking companies is the same kind of questions. Are they ready for the impacts of climate change? Are they ready for the transition to net zero emissions? But unfortunately, at the moment, the information that investors are getting from companies is really inadequate, and it's not really allowing investors to sort of, kick the tyres of many companies to see if they're adequate investments in the face of climate risk.
But why is that? I mean, we've been talking about this. I think you and I have probably had conversations about this on the radio for some time now. We have a voluntary code of disclosure of climate-related risks, and about, as I understand it, half of the ASX 300 companies are disclosing climate risks voluntarily. The ASX says the disclosures are improving. So why is that not good enough? What's not happening?
Well, if we've got 50% of the ASX 200 disclosing or 300 disclosing, what about the other 50%? We also need to be thinking about the quality of the disclosures that are being given to investors and to the market. So at the moment, a lot of those disclosures don't examine scenarios which are consistent with reducing emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. They don't consider fully what is going to happen with more extreme heat waves, more extreme floods, more extreme weather. So the kinds of disclosures that we're getting are currently not adequate, and that's why we're seeing around the world, from countries like the UK to the EU to Singapore to Hong Kong to Brazil, they're implementing these mandatory schemes essentially in collaboration with business and investors to make sure that the information is available in the market for everyone in the market to adequately price these risks, and also critically to invest in climate solutions.
If companies are going through doing the work of making some kind of climate report, now you're saying it's not good enough, it's not relevant enough, it's not high standard enough. Is that because they don't care enough? Is it because they don't understand what they're sort of talking about really in terms of the impacts of, say, net zero emissions by 2050, or they're trying to hide from their investors the real state of risk?
Well, this is the problem. In some respects, we don't know because we're actually not getting the kinds of disclosures that we need from companies. The important point here also, this is just not about companies. This is also about our own members, so the Investor Group on Climate Change members like institutional investors, banks, insurers also being covered. Because what we really need if we're going to manage the systemic risks of climate change, which the Reserve Bank and others have said are a real threat to our national economy, we need to have all of this information in the market so investors, companies, financial regulators and governments can be cognizant of the risks and managing those risks appropriately. And if we have more information in the market, the other thing that will happen is that investors will start to put more money into the solutions of climate change. You'll start to unlock investment in things like clean hydrogen, renewables, new low-emission manufacturing, etc.
So once companies quantify the risk, then those around the board tables will say we've got to do something to bring that risk down, and that will open up investment in new technologies.
That's right, but also the disclosures we're talking about are not just about risk, they're also about opportunities. So what we see from good disclosures from companies is that they're not only identifying the risks of climate change, they're identifying the opportunities, and they're also, what they're doing is aligning their capital expenditure, their company strategy to take advantage of those opportunities. But at the moment, that's a very small number of companies, and we need to expand the coverage of their disclosures so investors, companies and regulators can work together to ensure that we have a robust national economy.
Who's doing it well in Australia?
Well, there's been a number of, we've seen companies such as BHP, for example, which have come up with their disclosure. They were really at the forefront of this a number of years ago. We've seen good disclosures from other companies such as Rio Tinto. But it's the core issue here is that while we're getting some good disclosures from some companies, we've still got a very long tail. And unless we actually start to capture that tail, we're not going to be adequately managing the risks to the economy.
Now, I think your position is that, the regulators need to get on board with this. But if companies don't get better at this and don't get more transparent and aren't treating this as a sort of a mandatory responsibility, then they're going to lose out in investment. That money, that capital will flow to other companies. Why do you say that?
Because what we're seeing from international markets is that mainstream investment decisions are factoring in carbon risk on a daily basis. This is mainstream global investor practice now. And companies and investors are using these reports on a daily basis to assess how they're going to put money into these companies and also into countries. So unless you have a good, robust disclosure framework, what we're going to see is investors increasingly going to those countries which have good disclosure frameworks because it gives them more confidence that all the risks are being managed and observed, and they can feel more confident that they can invest in those companies and jurisdictions.
Does this need to start with the regulators? Are they on board with what you're suggesting? Do they want mandatory enforcement? And would that mean, for instance, big fines for companies that didn't do this well, didn't disclose climate modelling and climate risk?
Well, I think this is, it's not just about the regulators. The regulators have been playing an incredibly important role within the limits of their mandates to raise awareness about climate-related risk in Australia. But however, we need a more collaborative approach now. We've done a lot of experimentation on this over the last few years. Now it's time for a proper process to implement, along with our major trading partners, a more mandatory and clearer regime. And that will require the work of the financial regulators. It also requires the work of the Federal Treasury. And it also is a real opportunity for the government to engage with its partners internationally through the G20, where this is being discussed, to actually come up with a good, solid framework to cut red tape to business and make it easier for investment in low-emission technology.
And talking of companies, what about countries? I mean, Australia just released the intergenerational report yesterday. The Federal Treasury released that. It's a projection of where we'll be at 40 years on. The Grattan Institute is critical of it because it says the IGR failed to make projections about the scale of loss of export earnings or the impacts from global warming, including drought and natural disaster. Now, in fact, the report does warn that emissions-intensive commodities export earnings will fall as global efforts to combat climate change are accelerated. Is that enough? Is that precise enough, or should more work be being done for a report like that?
Well, we do need, as we've talked about before, Fran, a really strong, good policy framework in Australia to make all of these things happen. And I'll just give you an example of what happens if you don't have that. So at the moment, if you're an investor and you've got access to a Bloomberg finance terminal anywhere in the world, and you want to go and look at it if you want to invest in an oil and gas company across the world, at the moment, when you go to that terminal, the Australian oil and gas companies are at the bottom of that list, along with the ones from Saudi Arabia and from Russia. The reason that is there is because we don't have adequate disclosure frameworks. They're not adequate disclosures, but also we don't have a good long-term national strategy to reduce emissions to net zero. So when you're an international investor, you go into those terminals, Woodside and Santos are not even going to appear to you because they're at the bottom of the list and you're not going to invest in them. So that is why we need a clear and solid international framework to manage these long-term risks because they're not going to go away.
Erwin Jackson, thanks very much for joining us again on Breakfast.
My pleasure.
Erwin Jackson is the Director of Policy at the Investor Group on Climate Change.